really thrilled to introduce the next two scholars around election administration and funding and costs. Everyone has already been introduced, but we have Zach Moore from right here, hometown boy now, I guess, and then Martha Croft from North Carolina to inform us about the work that they've done over at least the last decade or more than a decade, almost.
2017 or so.
2017. And so
2016, yeah. So thank you very much to our hosts today. And Zach asked me this morning, based on like a famous scholar, a well-known scholar came to speak at the University of Kansas and their school last week, he said, I just really enjoyed it because he said, what really bugs you? And he said, Martha, what bugged you to get started with this study? I'm like, Zach, I don't know. I can't answer that. What bugged me? And I did start, I said, I'm going to have to tell you later because I can't think of it. So now is as good a time as any to tell you, Zach, what bugged me. Honestly, when I got started with this, the kind of data that we had as a country for voter turnout was ridiculous. You could not easily get data from every jurisdiction in the country and compare voter turnout. This is exacerbated by the fact that, as Mitchell, some of her scholarship has indicated, and what we've said many times today, is we have different language for many of these concepts in elections that you would think, golly, if you just walk into it and start studying it, well, isn't it obvious? Well, it's not, because we talk about things differently. So I would suppose if you looked at the things that bugged me, it was calling something like 352 Texas counties to find out how many people actually voted in their election, how many ballots were cast, as opposed to how many voted in the top contest. And so it seemingly I've dedicated my career to getting some data that other people don't, I suppose. While I'm not saying that Mitchell didn't get the data, we actually started about the same time on the study. We just took differing approaches. And in fact, our approach started with a lunch conversation that I had with Zach when a bunch of professors went out to lunch at the Flying Saucer, a well-known bar near campus. No, we weren't drinking. We had to teach that afternoon. And I said to Zach, I'm trying to finish my second book. This one thing is really bugging me. There's a couple of articles. This woman named Hill wrote an article in 2012 where she used some data to learn about some of the spending in elections. And I said, there's a couple of others, but it's just like, really, there's nothing. And Zach said, oh, Martha, it's highly doubtful that we could get those kind of data. How much are we spending on elections? He's like, it's just would be impossible.
Small, very small.
And it's very, very small, not impossible.
Right.
Small probability, right? And I said, oh, well, that's just too bad. I'll put in what I can, which was a few slides from Tammy Patrick. This was, what was this, 2012 or something? That's 13, 14, somewhere in that time frame. A couple of slides from other people, but there wasn't much. And it was very exciting the day that Zach came up to me and said, Martha, you will never guess what I found. You're going to love it. He had found, tell us what you found.
We'll go over this later, but we found election cost data.
He found cost data in North Carolina. So, just so you know. First, though, before we tell you any more about our research, we really want to tell you that our co-author, Mary Jo McGowan, is an instrumental part of our work, but she is not here today. The MIT Election Data and Science Lab funded our research, so thank you, Charles, for funding our research for 2 rounds of data collection that paid for an MPA student to painstakingly look for this cost data. And so we had a lot of help from also Joellen Pope, who is a co-author on articles about North Carolina. And lots of Zach's MPA students, including Kawan, has collected some newer data for us, which we are so appreciative of. So, of course, the questions are elections underfunded is the fundamental question that we'd love to be able to answer with this. And it turns out I'm not so sure that we actually answer this question. I think before we can answer this question, we have to have some sort of data that we can look at from a very high level and try and think about how much are these local jurisdictions spending. We are also, though, interested in how elections can be better funded. We have data from our forthcoming book, which is currently under review, but will be published by Cambridge University Press Elements series. So it is a short book with lots of charts and graphs and a lot of information about fiscal years and other things that we really worked for. We're going to discuss recent developments and options. And Zach, actually, I'm not going to take credit for this. Zach has some great ideas, and I, after having read them and thinking that these are wonderful ideas, so like I said, we know that spending on local election administration is influenced by technical factors like the type of equipment and changes in procedures, and that was the Hill article that I mentioned. They use California funding information, which is also quite open. But once we had the North Carolina data in hand, we were able to really start thinking about, or the North Carolina data in hand, we were able to start thinking about how does spending vary across counties in North Carolina, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we also found with some of this data that election administration spending is affected by politics, and most specifically politics, the partisan composition of the county commission, which I think Jamie and Secretary Schwab last night really made clear to us that partisanship, or at least how much the county commission likes you, may actually matter in how much money you are able to get to run an election in your county. There are also the article by McGowan et al., so Mary Jo McGowan and us. We're looking at trade-offs. And it's very interesting. I started with the idea of, well, we had a congressional scholar that I'm sure Charles knows of, Douglas Arnold, that talked about how members of Congress are always thinking about what their constituents want to do, and they are trading off in the types of spending. So if they vote for this kind of spending, it's sort of a zero-sum game. They're not voting for that kind of spending. And so we started to apply that idea with trade-offs in funding in North Carolina. Zach and Mary Jo then followed up more on this and looking at Jacobs, sort of looking at intertemporal distributed trade-off theory. So policy choices are determined by both timing of outcomes. When is that, park built, the park built?
Pavilion, yeah.
Right, the pavilion, thank you, and preferences about distribution of the money. But we sort of found out there is some other scholarship. So Joellen and I wrote a book chapter for one of Mitchell's 7 books, which was talking about how the spending affects voter turnout, and how Barry Burden and Jacob Neal Hysil, and I'm sure I said that wrong because I don't know Jacob, but they also found that spending affects voter turnout. So there's a little bit of scholarship on it. I'm going to turn the slides over to Zach, who is going to, let me just say, though, an interesting conversation right before I walked into the room was with Julie Wetstein from Anderson County. So my nephew there went to Anderson County High School because the high school in his community was so terribly small that someone who was gifted really wasn't getting pushed. Is that accurate? The way they needed to be. So he went to a high school at least 45 minutes away from home, but my brother lives in Coffee County. There's a nuclear plant in Coffee County. The roads are paved in Coffee County. The roads where my brother lives, which is 1 mile from Coffee County, can you guess how those roads are? They are not paved. The elections, better funded. Funny how those things work out, right? And so these are things that we're thinking about when we're looking at the cost of elections. So thank you, Julie, for the really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Martha. And thanks to Tammy and the Dole Center for having us out. As we said, we first want to answer this question or begin to attempt to answer this question of is elections administration underfunded in the United States? And as Martha said, we found cost data on it in North Carolina first, and then we started collecting it in all the other states. For a variety of reasons, we get 48 out of 50 states. Michigan and Wisconsin are very, very disaggregated systems and very complicated funding arrangements, so they're not actually in our analysis. And as Charles said that I will talk about cost objects. I am mostly a budget and accounting person. I am not an elections administration person by training.
He is now.
Yeah, I think I'm getting pulled into this orbit. So the cost object here is not the cost of an election. What is the marginal cost of an election? What did it cost you to run that election in August or in November? But rather, what is your total cost, the cost of elections administration throughout the entire year? And the reason that we chose the costs of elections administration is exactly what Mitchell got into with the complications of the timing of the primaries and all the other costs that go on throughout the year. And so we really look at elections administration expenditures by when we can find them in the annual financial reports, sometimes called annual comprehensive financial reports or others, whatever's required by the state. When we can find them, the total costs being spent throughout the entire year as reported by the election jurisdiction, and there's variation in that, that's what we are collecting here. For a variety of reasons, this is a very lower bound estimate of the costs of elections administration. I want to be very clear that our work is similar to some of the other estimates of cost out there, but this is only at the local level. This is only really operations and maintenance. It's not the capital expenditures. There is some of that. There's also, other costs that go into the running of elections that may not be accounted for in that little fund that is your elections fund. A great example is from Alabama, where we were talking to somebody about who all is involved in this, and I think they gave us more than five offices. The sheriff was involved because, they are the only ones that have, secure server space. So all of our elections equipment or elections rolls are on the server. So how do you account for, the cost of the server when, you're only talking about like 5% of the server space or something? We don't have those costs in here. So this is a very lower bound estimate of the costs of elections administration as reported by the local governments themselves. We adjust it to $2020 with the CPIU. I actually have a ton more in here, or in the book, we go into excruciating detail about.
Sell it, Professor Moore.
It is excruciating. Please buy our book.
But buy it anyway.
Well, I feel like this audience is the one audience that might appreciate the excruciating detail a bit, right? But yeah, that timing issue, oh my gosh,
The
we worked.
fiscal years?
The fiscal years, I mean, it was so hard. There were actually fiscal year ends in every month except for one. Anybody have any guess what that one month was?
November?
Oh, no, there's fiscal, because they don't care about the election. They're
that's true.
worried about the finances. I hate to say it that way, but that's true. It's February. It's February, because it's a short month. Nobody wants to end on a short month, right? So, I mean, there's so many things I can go on and on about. I won't. So let's stop and make some predictions here, because this is really kind of we're talking about the North Carolina data, but we want to start talking about our book and this whole data that we were able to collect. So this is looking at those 48 states. So stop and make a prediction here. Which state do you think is going to spend the most, and which state do you think is going to spend the least on elections administration? I mean, like, you might even write this down, because I'll be shocked, unless you're from one of these states, you might get this. And then think about what the direction of the trend will look like from 2008 to 2016. And I will note that we focus on 2008 to 2016 because that's a span of time where we think elections administration funding isn't being influenced by exogenous shocks, because before 2008, you had that HAVA funding that would hit, and so you see that in the annual financial reports. You also have, and we just weren't able to collect it, but there would be some shocks in 2020 as well. So this is a good kind of, normal-ish time period to look at. So what will the direction of the trend look like in 2008 to 20? We look at it in spending per registered voter here. We also look at it at spending per voter, and the trends generally hold. There's just some weird things that happen when you look at spending per voter, because the voting is highest in the presidential election years, and so that cost per voter goes way down in those years. And so it's a cleaner story to talk about cost per registered voter. Yeah. Do you want to register your hypothesis on the highest and lowest spending?
The states?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a really tough one.
I think you might have some ideas, though. After our conversation last night, I think you have some ideas.
Let's go on. Let's not.
Come on.
I would say probably the lowest is I would say Mississippi, and I would think maybe California because of the cost of living, but also it's either California or Florida. I think they put a lot into their at the county level.
Yeah. And where were you, election director?
Florida.
And alas, that's what we found. The highest spending was actually in Florida. But when you talk to people, they don't think that. They think that the highest spending, of course, is going to be in California or New York, and they're relatively high spenders. But Florida has made a lot of gains in how much it's spending on elections and improving elections. So Florida and California get close to spending about $20 per voter. You can't really see the chart very well, but it's like $19.90 some. And then at the very lowest end is Vermont. Vermont is actually the lowest, and just a little over $2 per voter. But if you think about how elections are done on average, or the Vermont is very local and may not have as much equipment, and it may be more volunteer-based. So I would love to go to Vermont. If you have connections in Vermont, I want to go to Vermont and study elections.
Actually,
fall?
I have a
fall,
cousin
please.
there too. So
So I want to go to Vermont and in the fall and see. Yeah.
Can I say, one thing I think it's really important is that I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, for some, spending the most or the least is a badge of honor or shame. So depending on who it is, they might say, we invest in our elections in Florida. and others will say, oh my God, we're spending way more than we need to. That is
Right.
atrocious. So it's always important that no matter where you are, knowing that there is this continuum and contextualizing it and framing it is so critical.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And a point that, you know, we've kind of been dancing around is that not having the data, we can't say definitively, is spending $100 per voter bad? Well, there's several jurisdictions in our data set that spend over $100 per voter. But that might be, you know, something that would be a problem in some jurisdictions. Yeah.
States like Louisiana, the top-down states, do you find more efficiencies with those states? Just on your graph.
They're, as Mitchell alluded to, they're the hardest to collect. So I would not want to make any, I wouldn't want to make any statements about that.
So there is great variation in spending, but there's also great variation in where we can actually obtain these cost reports. Not every jurisdiction includes in the annual financial reports the data about elections. And so we collected as many as we can. Sometimes they're centralized, as they are in North Carolina. And it was relatively, the first year of the grant was getting some of the states that were easier. The second year was spent just collecting what we possibly could in some of those locations.
No, it's a great point. And yeah, the complexities of this data collection are really hard. Not only do sometimes you aggregate up the costs of elections administration into other offices like the clerk's office, and so that we can't break those out, so those are missing in the data set. Sometimes, especially this is problematic in small jurisdictions, the financial reports just aren't available. So there's serious issues that we have to think about when we think about the quality of the data. And so when we get to the confidence piece, maybe we can briefly mention that we only look at about 11 or 14 states that are really good, high quality data. So, okay. So this is the trend, and as you mentioned, perfectly segue. In 2008, you know, it was almost $11 per voter, per registered voter rather, and then in 2011 it bottoms out. But even in 2012, the presidential election year, 2012, the spending per registered voter still did not increase to 2008 levels, and it really didn't increase past 2008 levels until 2016. So we know that there was more things going on in elections, but during those post-recessionary years, just like you mentioned, the pressure on local government's finances just wouldn't allow them to spend as much as they had been spending. And so this I think is probably one of the key pieces of information when you're talking with people about the problems of local election funding, is that they're fiscally constrained to begin with, and then any time there is a fiscal shock or there's going to be another shock to the system like the pandemic, we forget that the local governments were also worried about their sales tax, and so they were very conservative in, you know, their spending during 2020. So yeah. All right, let's make another prediction from the book. What will the direction of the trend look like for the different regions? This was kind of one of the big surprises for us. We tend to assume that elections are pretty easy and they're going to be the same across the country. I mean, this was actually one of the more shocking things to us. And then within a state like Kansas or North Carolina, what does that spending look like? So this is actually what it looks like over time. Some of the really interesting things, the one that probably pops out to all of us is the amount that is being spent in the West from 2008 to 2016 per registered voter has actually gone way, way down. And so I think it's not surprising that when I hear about people that are the most fiscally stressed, it comes from Western states that are probably being pushed in this direction. Interestingly, and you can't see this, I should have used the color figure. I used the one from the book. I should have used the color figure, but the squares are the South, and the cost per registered voter is actually rising in the South, and I think that's a good trend. But I also think that is maybe not just a trend of we want to spend more, but also people are moving to the South and they have more to spend, and so they have those slack resources. In the Midwest, you see kind of that up and down cyclical pattern of spending that comes from in presidential or even year elections, more spending, and then it goes down, and so that's part of the nature of our data. And then the Northeast is a little bit similar to California in that it goes down, but right in the last couple of years it goes back up. So it about recovers. Within a state, there's large variation within a state. For example, in Charlotte, where we were living at UNC Charlotte, they may spend $3, $4, $5 per voter on per registered voter. But if you look out in the West and on the East Coast, the most rural, least populated areas, it is not unusual for local governments to spend $25, $30, $35 per registered voter to conduct elections out in those most rural areas, and I think that's a key thing.
Well, I think that we need to make sure it's crystal clear that when we're comparing these costs, we're considering a lot of factors, including the size of the county, the population size of the county. So we should, of course, we're going to talk about economies of scale.
Right. Yeah. So those economies of scale really matter, and quite simply, you have to spend more in jurisdictions that have
Per voter.
Per voter.
Or registered voter, right? Because everybody has startup costs,
Yeah.
right? And those are fairly large. When you live in a large county like Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is, or Wake County, where Raleigh is, you're spending less per voter because that amount of money is more spread out.
Yep. And we see the same thing in Kansas as well. The most rural western Kansas counties are the ones that are spending the most. And again, we don't want to be negative about this. This is just a fact of the data and the fact of economies of scale in very rural counties. And so hopefully this data could be helpful to some. Here is the economies of scale. Interestingly, I think the thing that may be surprising to some that study elections administration cost is the diseconomies of scale towards the end. But you'll see from about just over the very smallest jurisdictions are spending $10, $11 per voter. But once you get up to about $500,000 up to about 2.5 million, the cost per voter goes down to about $3 or $4 per voter. And so you have that diseconomy, or the economies of scale. Interestingly, though, you also have diseconomies of scale, but that's in very large jurisdictions. And those jurisdictions tend to do other things as well, like campaign finance and other things. So I want you to mostly focus on the economies of scale. And finally, the money matters. I'm going to turn this over to Martha because this is her wheelhouse.
For all of the reasons that Mitchell mentioned, we didn't think that this could be possible, but we were wondering, well, what are the implications of the spending? Why don't we just take these data and connect it to a large public opinion survey that's done during the presidential election years at least? So 2008, 2016, and 2012, we connected the survey for the performance of American elections, which is done out of Medsel, Charles's research outfit, and we connected spending data to those data. However, we weren't looking at all of the states that are possible in Charles's data set. We only looked at, well, depending on the day, and I think we finally ended up with 9, we really sat down and evaluated how good was the spending data, how complete was the spending data across the states that we were looking at. And so we narrowed it down to 9 states which we had the most complete, and we thought the best data, and we merged that in with the public opinion data. So if you lived in Riley County, Kansas, my hometown, this is how much per voter they were spending, for example. We actually didn't end up evaluating Kansas. And actually, for one of the analysis, we didn't even do North Carolina because later on, it's less complete. And what we found, what you're seeing here is first, your confidence in elections is the chart on the left, and your belief in fraud is the chart on the right. And so as you spend more money, you're actually seeing a declining trust, generally speaking, right in both of these charts. I'll just call it trust, but confidence in the elections. But then you see as they spend more money, there's an increasing cost of elections. And it's a pretty, we think trust in elections, right? Thank you. So it's a pretty complex relationship. Again, we never thought that this would work, but it did. There is a statistically significant relationship between the spending per registered voter and a voter in a county's belief or trust, generally speaking.
Great, thank you. So I think we're probably about out of time. I do want to touch the highlights of fleshing out a proposal for consistent, meaningful, and equitable funding, and then hit some conclusions and remaining questions, because I want to get your questions. What we've talked about here is that, the local funding is constrained, particularly during periods of fiscal stress or problems, and the state and local governments really aren't able to keep up with their needs. Since 2016, we are also constraining resources that local governments can get from private funders as well, so that takes away another source of funding. And so, when you take away resources, you need to find more resources as well. And so, we, in talking with Audrey, it made me realize that one of the interesting things about our data is that, it does kind of make the case that not only do we need meaningful and consistent federal funding, but it also probably needs to be equitable as well. And so if you follow that economies of scale line, what I would suggest is that we kind of think about how to scale our funding. one thing that I've heard recently is if we could just get the federal government to give us $1 per voter, that would be great. Just $1, yes. But I've heard that a lot, so I feel like that's a solid place to start. The problem with that, of course, is that at the very largest jurisdictions, the lowest part of that cost curve, $1 would be about a third of your spending could be funded by the federal government. Whereas if you were the smallest jurisdictions, that's about a tenth of your budget. So what we need to do is think about those economies of scale and perhaps give more money to those small jurisdictions. I know they serve fewer people in the electorate, but they're still critically important, I think. We've also tossed around the ideas of like revolving loan funds for capital needs. We'd be interested in getting your thoughts or opinions about that.
Let me just throw in there's a Clean Water Act fund, and so states have, that is a loan fund that the federal government pays into. Now, they pay back money. The jurisdictions that use it then pay back those loans. I'm not so sure that a loan fund is what we need as much as maybe there's some sort of board with a fund that can help local jurisdictions. Of course, the problem is there's varying capacities for writing grants, which I think is a big reason why the Zuckerberg funds and even the Schwarzenegger funds seemed on their face to be very unequally distributed.
You know, there's other considerations that we would love to get your input on. One that we definitely know we've heard a lot about is money should go directly to the local election jurisdiction. Tends to be the fact that the federal money tends to get held up at the state level. We think that would be an important thing, but there's other considerations as well. So we'd like to hear your thoughts on that. We have some conclusions for the research that, you know, we need to look into more, most importantly, past 2016. And so bringing the state level into the analysis. This is only the local government. And for policy, you know, we want to address how consistent is consistent, what is meaningful and equitable. Should we do a $1 per voter? Is the 3-2-1 proposal a good idea? Is something else? And then, you know, these pragmatic considerations, Charles' evidence about people's lack of awareness of where the money comes from is really important. Resistance to and how to sell any sort of funding proposal. So I'd like to hear more from Charles eventually about that. And then just more generally, just this whole idea of the politicization of election funding is something that I find to be just absolutely not the way we should go. This is definitely a bipartisan issue, and we would love to hear your thoughts.
So much to chew on there. I will say that the slides that Martha referenced back in 2010, Maricopa County in Arizona, we were trying to decide, are we charging the right amount for the jurisdictions that we're conducting elections for? Because hadn't changed the fees in well over a decade. And I realized that we didn't really know what our elections cost. So I pulled together, those of you who know me will be shocked that it was a very long slide deck on what elections cost and why, and really tried to lay out what it was. And I looked across the state of Arizona. We were very fortunate that Arizona has 15 counties, so it's pretty easy to see, you know, call everybody in like 30 minutes and find out what was being charged. And it was wildly different for what Pima County was charging a voter to be, you know, per jurisdiction for Tucson to be on their ballot than what we were charging Chandler or Goodyear or Scottsdale or whatever. And so it was just really informative, and we realized that we were undercharging those jurisdictions, and I needed that information to go to the city and town clerks to say, this is what it's actually costing. These are all the things, because you kind of have to do a little bit of a salespersonship in it. I've included all the things that we weren't charging for because we got the equipment from the Help America Vote Act funds, or we got, certain signage and things from HSSA grants, or we had an FVAP grant, the EASE grant. So demonstrating why they were being asked to pay for certain things and why we were asking for a certain amount. And that can be a very hard story to sell and to demonstrate, but I think that we were able to do that, and we, changed the rates without too much grumbling because people saw what they were paying for. But that is a challenge to do, and we had the luxury of me having the time to just, be able to do that, and most offices don't have that luxury. So it's something to try and think about, how am I capturing the costs in my office? How can what more do I need to know in order to make sure that things are right-sized? And if you don't collect any sorts of fees, that's another thing that I think this project is really going to talk about, is what kind of revenue and where are funds coming from in certain jurisdictions across the country, and is that an untapped resource? So with that, I want to open up. We have time for a couple of questions. We'll go to Clerk Shu.
First of all, I'm very excited that Zach's now in our community, so we get to work on stuff
Lucky
together.
ducks.
It dawned on me as you were talking about it, if you were to look at my budget, it's going to throw off some of your numbers. And the reason why is because of tax lid legislation. Used to be, my budget reflected how much an election cost, because in a presidential, I'd spend $1 million. In an odd year, I'd spend $600,000. And so I would fluctuate my budget. Kansas passed tax lid legislation where your budget was based off your prior year. And we were concerned that if it went down, I wasn't going to be able to come back up. So we basically have now set my budget at a presidential level, knowing that for most years, I'm not going to spend about $400,000. I'll put some of it into capital reserves. Some of that goes back to the general fund. It's bad budgeting, but it was necessary because the concern was under the Revenue Neutral Act, I wouldn't be able to come back up. So when I was looking at your numbers, one thing to consider is sometimes there's a policy that has nothing to do with it that's going to make it look like I spend $1 million every year on elections when I actually don't.
Right.
The thing is, Jamie, that this is actual spending, so this wouldn't be your budget. This is the actual amount that was spent, so it's for the prior year.
This is,
But-
it's expenditures.
Unless
So
you
the-
spend it, we wouldn't.
But the one thing that's really important is that you're not looking, my actual spending is still $1 million, but my capital transfer that's in that number,
Well,
the capital transfer of 300 to 400,000, it still looks like I spend that. So you have to
Okay.
make sure you look at that.
All the other researchers in the room, close your ears. This is going to be this is a great research project. Yeah, but this is a public budget and finance
Well,
project, so
so-
I'm less worried about the.
yeah, well, what's
stealing
what we finally, because of the differences in fiscal year, we actually, for this study, had to put the money together for 2 years, and it would still be distorted by that, right? Because you're going to be the same in 2 years. But looking at it over 2 years will, I think, sort of work some of that. Remember, this isn't the details, this is a big amount. But we really appreciate this comment, and we'll see where we can put it in.
Charles. Oh, sorry.
Unfortunately, actually, we have.
Well, actually, so since we're at time, just two things, which is really more kind of comments. I mean, one, actually, I would be curious to see what your county's fiscal people are telling the Census Bureau, because the Census Bureau is accounting for things like interfund transfers, et cetera, when they're, so counties are able to kind of do this disentangling when they're talking to the Census Bureau. I'm just be kind of curious to see how that worked with respect to elections. That's just kind of a, the research side. The second thing I just want to throw in here for conversation, and maybe it comes up this afternoon, but the greater per capita cost in smaller jurisdictions. If we look at other areas of public policy that have been seen historically as been core to democracy, and I'll pick one at random, public education. A century ago, we had 10 times more school districts in America than we do now. Okay, 90% of school districts have disappeared through consolidation. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them being the greater demands placed on schools and the inability of small counties and small towns to accomplish those things. So there's been consolidation. And even when there's not been formal consolidation, there's been functional consolidation by the state, providing all sorts of services. So another possibility, another implication of what kind of this 3-2-1 plan is that, and I know kind of what the answer is going to be, but I think it's worth talking about. Why not consolidate, either functionally or otherwise, small jurisdictions to at least share costs? Because of the sunk costs of elections. I mean, what are you talking about? If you have an election official, that's going to cost something. If you have at least one ADA piece of machinery in every county, that's going to cost the same thing regardless. So again, I mean, there's other ways of dealing with these economies and diseconomies of scale that aren't only adding more money. There are also institutional ways of dealing with it. So.
And I think that there are some jurisdictions, at least for procurement, have been looking at doing that kind of model around consolidation of RFPs in order to economize and get, the same deal that a place like Maricopa County was getting for the same piece of equipment. Another jurisdiction was getting it, for a lot more because of the economies of scale. So having that sort of collaboration and ability to collaborate is a challenge. So.
This proposal, I feel like I have to say, yes, there's consolidation, and there's rural school aid models across the state, across the country as well, and different by state, but it also exists in recognition of this, so probably both have.
All right, closing thoughts by Matt here, and then we're going to get to lunch.
Sorry. One more thing, and it kind of builds on what Charles just said. I wonder how much is being caught in this data of how many elections a jurisdiction has in a year, right? I mean, Florida's up there on the very high end of spending, but Florida has 1 million elections. I mean, if you talk to election officials in Florida, I mean, you talk to Miami, they have an election every Tuesday. And so, I mean, to Charles' point about consolidation, it doesn't have to be consolidation of elections offices, but we can consolidate when we do elections. We have very haphazard election policies across the country, and just solving that problem would drive down costs without doing anything else.
Yeah, how full the ballot is questionable, and then at what cost, voter roll-off, residual vote rate, all of those things, and so yeah, absolutely. So I believe let's first thank our panelists. Sorry.